I am Max Grossman. I'm the director of the Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff Program and Center for Jewish Studies here at University of Maryland, where we have Testudo with us. It is a tremendous pleasure to introduce Professor Marsha Rozenblit to our esteemed setting. Marsha is the second speaker in a new occasional series called the 5 Points Lecture Series, which is a bit of a quirky idea, but the idea is that scholars work in fields and with literature and engaging methodologically, but that scholars are also driven by sometimes unusual questions, pieces of data, or moments of scholarly discovery. And that by asking scholars to think about the 5 points, the 5 questions, statements, concepts, pieces of data that have driven their scholarship, you get to see a different perspective on their work and also have the opportunity to hear them reflect on the work that they've been doing. It is, as I said, a tremendous pleasure to introduce you all to Professor Marsha Rozenblit, who needs no introduction but is going to get one anyway. Professor Rozenblit is the Harvey M. Meyerhoff Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of Maryland, where she's been on the faculty since 1978. I would be remiss if I did not make the comment that Marsha is the Vatika of our program, having the longest institutional memory of Jewish studies on campus and having served at all faculty levels and as director of the Meyerhoff Center. That was from 1998 to 2003. We are not the only ones to recognize and benefit from Professor Rozenblit's leadership. She has served as the president of the Association for Jewish Studies between 2009 and 2011. She's been a fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research for quite a while now. And she's also among the faculty leaders in the UMD Department of History, where she's guided the process for many a graduate student to complete their dissertations and many a colleague to make it through the tenure and promotion process to associate or full professor. Her scholarship, in other words, is one that shares and gives to her field and her unit. Professor Rozenblit is a social historian of the Jews of Austria-Hungary and its successor states, and she's the author of both The Jews of Vienna, 1867 to 1914, Assimilation and Identity. Thank you, we have visual aids. And Reconstructing a National Identity, The Jews of Habsburg, Austria, during World War I. Again, thank you for the visual aid. She's co-editor of the volumes Constructing Nationalities in East Central Europe with Peter M. Judson and World War I and the Jews, Conflict and Transformation in Europe, the Middle East and America with Jonathan Karp. Professor Rozenblit is not only a prolific scholar, but a scholar whose work has had deep impact. She's written many articles on such subjects as Jewish religious reform in 19th century Vienna, Jewish courtship and marriage in 1920s Vienna, and Jews and German culture in Moravia, 1848 to 1938. Like many historians, like many scholars in general, she has work that takes her into new places. In the ancient world, that can be by centuries. In the modern world, it's often by decades. Thus, I think it's highly relevant and noticeable that her current scholarship explores the history of Jews from the former Habsburg monarchy who were lucky enough to flee Nazi Europe between 1938 and 1941. This work considers how they made or did not make new homes for themselves in the United States, Great Britain, and then British Mandate Palestine. I am eager to hear your thoughts, Marsha. I am eager to know how it all fits together or doesn't as you speak to us now about Assimilated with Other Jews, how to make sense of modern Jewish history.
Thank you so much, Max. That was lovely, as I knew it would be. I mean, because it comes from you, not because of me. So it's a great honor for me to be talking this afternoon, to speak in this series, to be the second speaker in this series. It's an honor in general, and it's an honor for reasons Max indicated, that I'm the Vatika, the veteran of the Jewish Studies program, and not the oldest person in the Jewish Studies program, but the person who's here the longest. And also because I'm the Harvey Meyerhoff Professor of Jewish History, and it's the Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff, his parents, Harvey's parents, Center for Jewish Studies. So I have lots of reasons to be honored, and I'm very happy to be honored. The 5 points is an interesting topic for a lecture series, but I can't think of 5 points that I want to make. I can only think of 2. So I'm going to make 2 points today, but I'll make them at length then, interestingly, I hope. I'll begin with my first point, which is embedded in my title, assimilated with other Jews. What does that even mean, assimilated with other Jews? And I'd like to begin with a story from my own childhood. In the summer of 1956, when I was 5 and a half, almost 6 years old, my father, who was a Holocaust survivor from Poland, was on a business trip in Burlington, Iowa, a little town, as my mother, who had New York superiority written all over her. My mother called it a 2-horse town. Actually, no, she called it a 1-horse town. I mean, whatever. He was on a business trip in Burlington, Iowa. He just worked for, he didn't do anything fancy. He worked for a store fixture company that was installing, store fixtures in some store in Burlington, Iowa. My mother and I had gone with him or met him there. And it was the summer, and a Polish non-Jewish man who my father worked with there asked him if he wanted to meet a Polish Jewish woman in town. And my father said, of course, So we went to the home of this woman, Rosa Rubin was her name. And we went to the home of this woman, and she and her husband and child or children, I don't remember, were sitting outside. And my father and this woman turned white. They knew each other. She was the younger sister of a friend of his. And of course, they had thought the other was dead. There was no reason to think that they thought they were alive. What is that? Oh, I don't know. It's not my phone, that noise. It's somebody else's phone who left it in my car, and I have to mail it, and it's ringing, and I don't know how to do anything with it. So hopefully it went on. Okay, so they knew each other, and after tears and hugs and all of that, she began to complain about how awful it was to live in Burlington, Iowa, because there were no Jews there. Well, there were some Jews. She was Jewish, her husband was Jewish. There were 15 Jewish families in this little town. And she was miserable being in such a small Jewish community. And my father said to her, but Rosa, even in Poland, you were already assimilated. And she said to him, yes, but in Poland, I was assimilated with other Jews. What she meant, of course, was that she wasn't religious in Poland already, but her social universe was composed entirely or almost entirely of other Jews. And in Burlington, Iowa, that was the case. That made a great impression on me, if I even remembered it. I don't know. My mother told the story endlessly, so maybe I only remember it through my mother's retelling. But it did make an impression on me as a Jewish girl from Brooklyn, where everyone was Jewish. Now, everyone wasn't Jewish, even in Brooklyn, but it seemed as if everyone was Jewish. Well, I'm a historian, so I did not set out to prove that Rosa Rubin was correct. But my scholarship has certainly proven her right, at least in the late 19th and early 20th century. It may no longer be right. I mean, that is, the situation of Jews may have changed significantly. But in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was correct. The central issue of modern Jewish history is the degree to which Jews, wherever they lived, assimilated or integrated or acculturated. I mean, various words have been used, but Jews left the world of traditional Jewish society and became part of the larger society in which they lived. They assimilated or acculturated or whatever into the societies in which they lived. That's one half of the equation. And the other half of the equation is the degree to which they remained Jewish and crafted new or recrafted old ways of being Jewish. This was true in Western Europe, in Central Europe, in Eastern Europe, in North America. It was probably true in the Middle East as well for those Jews who did modernize to some extent, but I'm not an expert on Middle Eastern Jews. My own work as a social historian grapples profoundly with this issue. My dissertation, which became my first book on the Jews of Vienna, that's why I had a copy of it, The Jews of Vienna, 1867 to 1914, Assimilation and Identity. This book showed in a kind of structural way how Jews assimilated or acculturated or integrated or transformed, but still remained Jewish. In that work, I did my dissertation. I got my PhD in 1980, and therefore I did my dissertation research in the 1970s when cliometrics was all the rage. That is, using a computer to do social history. In that work, in the dissertation, which became the first book, I collected data on Jews who lived in Vienna, and I created large samples of Jews from birth records and marriage records and Jewish communal tax records and high school or gymnasium registration records, all of which mentioned that people were Jewish, unlike the United States, which thinks that one's religion is one's personal business. No country in Europe, with the exception of England, of Great Britain, and then France after 1906, thought it wasn't their business to ask. And so, all public data had, that information. So I collected data from those various records, and I used a computer, a mainframe computer, and IBM cards. I mean, this was a long time ago. The IBM cards are still in my office if one wants to see what IBM cards look like. I used a computer to analyze all of these sample populations. And these records were fabulous, right? They gave me information on where people were born and where they had legal residence rights, because Austria distinguished between the two, and what they did for a living and where they lived in the city of Vienna, and how much they paid in taxes to the Jewish community, and so on and so on. And so, I had more information than that, but that gives you a sense of the kind of data that I had. And so I could study all sorts of things. I could study Jewish migration patterns to Vienna, where they came from, Jewish occupational transformations, Jewish residential concentration, Jewish marriage patterns, the use of education for social mobility, again, and on and on and on. I could study many things. And I realized that the Jews who had migrated to Vienna from other parts of the Habsburg monarchy, now I will share I have stuff to share. So let's take a quick look, and oops, there we go. So everybody can see that, I assume. So there's a picture of Austria-Hungary around 1900. I will show you the next map too, just so you have a sense. Austria-Hungary was a big country in the middle of Europe. There's the Russian Empire, there's Austria-Hungary, that's Germany, France, Italy, etc. And it was Austria-Hungary was the second largest had the second largest Jewish community in Europe. Russia was the largest with 5 million Jews. Austria-Hungary had over 2 million Jews. Germany had 500,000 Jews. France had 100,000. After we leave Austria-Hungary, we're dealing with small Jewish communities, but Austria-Hungary was really rather large. Anyway, so there is a clearer map of Austria-Hungary. And I realized that the Jews who migrated to Vienna from other parts of the monarchy, and they migrated first from Bohemia and Moravia, today's Czech Republic. They migrated from Western Hungary, from this area here, what is today Western Slovakia and Western Hungary. They migrated from, at the end of the 19th century, they also migrated from Galicia, which was traditionally part of Poland, became part of Austria at the end of the 18th century, went into Poland after World War I, and now the western part is in Poland, but the eastern part is in Ukraine. Lemberg, here is the city of Lviv, which you've heard of in the current war between Ukraine and Russia. So the Jews who migrated to Vienna from Bohemia and Moravia and Western Hungary and Galicia changed, right? They transformed themselves in the city. But they occupied distinct Jewish niches in the economy. They lived in distinct Jewish neighborhoods. They befriended and married each other, and they even went to school together. In other words, Jews assimilated, in quotation marks, or modernized or acculturated or whatever word you want to use, and they became part of Viennese society, became part of Austro-German society. But the very structure of their lives meant that they lived in a Jewish social universe and they assimilated with other Jews. So let me give you some examples of that. So first that's just a map of Europe. There's a map of Vienna. This is the city of Vienna. This is the Danube River. This is the Danube Canal. That's the inner city, which was the medieval city of Vienna. They took down the walls, they built the ring, and whatever. Okay, so there's a picture of Vienna. Jews had a niche in the economy. I don't have a picture of that. When Jews modernized, many of them abandoned the traditional commercial occupations which they had practiced in Central Europe, in Bohemian Moravia or Western Hungary, and they became clerks, salesmen, managers in private companies. That occupation becoming clerks and salesmen and managers. I mean, some people still were merchants, and of course, some people were professionals, but mostly a lot of them became that, what I just described. That meant that they probably no longer observed the Sabbath, right? Because private companies did business on Saturday. And it meant that they spoke German well and could read and write it well and dressed in a decent and respectable German way and so forth. But it was a Jewish niche in the economy because most people in Vienna did not work in that occupation. Most people in Vienna were either workers, in factories. Vienna wasn't primarily an industrial city, but nevertheless, they were workers. But they also worked as clerks for the government. Vienna was the government town, right? It was the seat of the imperial government, of the government of Austria, the government of the city of Vienna. So most clerks worked for the government. Jews didn't work for the government. They worked for private companies. So Jews were in a Jewish niche in the economy. In addition, Jews lived in Jewish neighborhoods. Those are two schematic maps of Vienna. It's not very clear because it comes from a Xerox from my book, and then scanned, so it's not very clear, but it's very obvious that Jews were concentrated. One of these maps is the concentration of Jews in the districts, and the other one is the concentration of each district, which was Jewish, right? And obviously Jews concentrated. They concentrated in Vienna's second district, which is called the Leopoldstadt, and they concentrated in Vienna's first district, the inner city, and Vienna's ninth district, the Alsergrund. That's where they lived. A few lived elsewhere, but I mean, this is the 20th district, which was part of the second district until around 1900. So it doesn't count as a separate area. The Leopoldstadt was known in Viennese slang as Die Matzinsel, the island of Matzah, because that's where the Jews lived, right? I mean, they weren't the only people in the district. They were actually only 35% of the district, but they concentrated in certain parts of it, and those areas were highly Jewish. So they concentrated residentially. School, let's see. Oh, that's Sigmund Freud. I don't want to talk about him yet. Jews, of course, because they were residentially concentrated, they tended to go to school with other Jews. Even Jews who went to that most assimilatory school, the Akademisches Gymnasium, the academic gymnasium, the secondary school, the Central European secondary school, in which the boys, it was only boys then, had 8 years of Latin and 5 years of Greek. I mean, that's what they studied. They studied 8 years of Latin and 5 years of Greek. They also learned history and math and science and stuff. But the gymnasium was obviously a vehicle for assimilation, but most Jews who went to gymnasium went to schools which were overwhelmingly Jewish. There were two gymnasien, there were two high schools in the first district, and 40% of the student body in those schools were Jewish. Jews were, by the way, about 9% of the population of the city. At the gymnasium in the second district, in the Leopoldstadt, Jews were between 75 and 80% of the population of the high school. And in the ninth district, they were 66%. I mean, that's enormous. That is enormous. And you could ignore the crucifixes on the walls, because despite the fact that the country was, had a liberal government. There were still crucifixes on the walls of the public schools. One could ignore the crucifixes on the walls if almost all your fellow students were Jews, right? Not all, but almost all. Your fellow students were Jews. So those are just three examples, but important examples. And I'd like to just talk briefly about this man, Sigmund Freud. I didn't study him in my book because I didn't deal with intellectuals. I just deal with ordinary people. I'm a social historian. I wanted to deal with ordinary people. But Sigmund Freud's an interesting case, and he's a wonderful example of being assimilated with other Jews. Obviously, Sigmund Freud was, assimilated in the sense that he, spoke German, and he wore German, he wore modern clothing and didn't cover his hair. In fact, we know that Sigmund Freud was exceedingly anti-religious. He didn't want to have a traditional Jewish wedding when he married his wife, but his wife came from an Orthodox family in Hamburg in Germany, and his mother-in-law pretty much said, "No chuppah, no Martha." Like, if you don't have a traditional Jewish wedding, you don't get to marry my daughter. So he did have a traditional Jewish wedding. That is probably the last Jewish religious thing he ever did. His wife continued to light Friday night candles, and he would light his cigar in the candles. I know that's a trope from Central Europe. Everybody's memoir talks about how their grandfather or their father lit cigars in the Friday night candles that the mothers continued to light. But never mind. I mean, he certainly was not religious. But Sigmund Freud lived in an entirely Jewish social universe. He certainly lived in the Ninth District, around the corner from Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, with whose his children played. He paid his taxes to the Jewish religious community. I mean, he had to, but he could have left it. He could have withdrawn from it, but he didn't. He paid his taxes to it. And virtually everybody in his social and intellectual circles was Jewish. I mean, in the Psychoanalytic Society, Ernest Jones, who was British, was not Jewish, and Carl Jung was not Jewish, but everybody else was. So, so he's a good example of that. Okay, so that's enough about the Jews of Vienna. My second book was on the Jews of Austria, of Habsburg Austria, the whole of Austria. Austria was actually divided into two. Hungary was a semi-sovereign country, and the rest was called, well, it was informally called Austria. Formally, it had a long name. The lands and whatever represented in the imperial parliament, but the rest was Austria. So my second book was on the Jews in Austria during World War I, and it was not a structural study like my first book, but rather it was a study of Jewish attitudes towards both Austria and towards Jewishness. The Jews in Austria, and about 300,000 Jews served in the Austrian army, Austro-Hungarian army during World War I. They were very loyal to Austria and very patriotic, but they regarded the war as both an opportunity to be patriotic Austrians, but also fight a Jewish war, because after all, for the first 2 years of the war, Austria was fighting Russia. And Russia invaded Galicia in 1914 and occupied it. Here's Galicia. This is Russian Poland. This is just a map of how the front shifted, and that need not concern us now. But what Austrian Jews felt was they were trying to defeat the evil enemy of the Jews, of the Austrians and of the Jews, and therefore they felt that their work was both Austrian and Jewish, and the fact that Austria had invaded Galicia encouraged that. But also, when they liberated Galicia, and they did with German army help in 1915, the Austrians pushed the Russians out of Galicia, and then the Russians came back in, and then they were pushed out again in 1916. But they also pushed the Russians out of Russian Poland. Most of Poland was occupied by Germany and Austria for most of World War I. And again, they were liberating the Jews of Eastern Europe from Russian tyranny, which was tyranny in general and tyranny against the Jews. So the war was actually very important at fostering both their Austrian identities and their Jewish identities. And therefore, they were very upset with the collapse of Austria-Hungary in November of 1918, because most of the successor states were anti-Semitic. Not all, but most were very anti-Semitic. During the war itself, there was a growth also of a sense of the Jews as a nation, as a separate nation, one of the nations of a multinational Habsburg monarchy. And because there was the growth of that sense, it was very hard to deal with the new nation states that replaced Austria. That's a map of Europe in 1922, where you have Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland. This is Yugoslavia. It wasn't called that until 1926. An enlarged Romania and so forth. Jews had a hard time with the successor states. But two final points about the war years, the World War I years. Jews served with a lot of other Jews in the army. I mean, most of the memoirs of soldiers were, make it very clear that Jews felt very comfortable in the army because they had a lot of fellow Jews in the army. And there were Jewish officers, unlike Germany, where there was de facto discrimination against Jews, and there were no Jewish officers except for doctors in the army. In Austria, there were lots. They have 70% of all reserve officers in the Habsburg army were Jews. And on the home front, which was mostly women's work, everyone who was helping, deal with people who were suffering because of the war were dealing with Austrian issues, but they were also dealing with Jewish ones, because during World War I, huge numbers of Galician Jews fled out of Galicia. They were afraid of the Russians. They thought the Russians would kill them, and they fled to Vienna and to Prague and to other places in Bohemia and Moravia. And go back to that map. They fled from Galicia to Vienna, to Bohemia and Moravia, including Prague. A little bit in Hungary, but not much, because the Hungarians didn't want them at all. But what it meant on the home front in Vienna or in Prague is that most Jewish women who were helping deal with the people suffering because of the war were helping fellow Jews, that is, Galician Jewish refugees, and that led to a strengthening of Jewish solidarity. Okay, that's my second one. The project I did after that, and thank you, Max, for talking about it, was about the Jews of Moravia. And this is just a map of interwar Czechoslovakia, but Bohemia and Moravia today and Silesia today are the Czech Republic, but in the interwar period and through 1989, they united with the Slovaks into this country called Czechoslovakia. But I was interested in the Jews of Moravia, and there I was exploring the relationship of Jews to German language culture, because most of the Jews in this area spoke German. And in this area was 2/3 Czech-speaking and 1/3 German-speaking. In 1945-46, the Czechoslovakia expelled the Germans, and so there are no German speakers there anymore. But until 1945, there were lots of Germans. There were 3 million Germans, and so what was the relationship of Jews to other Germans? And what did they think? The Jews in Moravia, about 75% of them said that they were German speakers, but they didn't feel that they were Germans. They felt that they were German Jews. That is, they were German-speaking Jews. They were part of a distinct community of German-speaking Jews within the complex situation of Bohemia and within the complex situation of Moravia. They may have gone to German schools and read German newspapers and attended the German theater, but they really did have a sense of themselves as a separate group. In Moravia in particular, they attended German Jewish schools, that is, schools that taught in German but were Jewish schools for Jews, and which also taught some Jewish subjects like prayer and Bible and so forth. They even came to see German as a Jewish language, one which Jews spoke to each other in the family and in the community. They also knew Czech. Only Americans think that you should be unilingual. People in this part of the world knew lots of languages. Okay, so that was that project. And by the way, in Interwar, this is just a scan from a book, but by somebody else, by Lichtenstein, by Tatiana Lichtenstein. But if you, I don't know how well you can see it, but this gives you the Czechoslovak census statistics on how many Jews considered themselves Jewish by nationality. Czechoslovakia allowed that in the interwar period. And this is the 1921 census and the 1930 census. But the majority, just the bare majority, 54% of Jews in 1921 and 57% in 1957 in Czechoslovakia said they were members of the Jewish nation. And that varied a lot. Bohemia was only about a fifth. In Moravia, it was about half. In Slovakia, also about half. And in Subcarpathia and Ruthenia, where everybody was Hasidic, where all the Jews rather were Hasidic, it was 87% and 93%. I think there the Hasidic Jews didn't think they were members of some modern political Jewish nation. I think they didn't understand the question, and they were Jewish. So they said they wrote, they said they were Jewish for the purposes of the census. But that gives you a sense of how Jews had a sense of themselves as a distinct group. And what did that even mean to most of them? I think I'll stop my, no, I'll stop the share. Jews had a sense of having a common history and destiny. And for some Jews, it also included religion, but not for all of them. And for some, it meant Zionism or some form of Jewish nationalism. For others, it just meant a vague sense of Jewish distinctiveness. It was very diverse. Okay, so that's my first point, that I was very much influenced by this notion of assimilated with other Jews. And a lot of my work has, in one way or another, explored that issue. My second point that I want to make, and I'm not going to go through my work to show how it has worked itself out, but it's very important to me, is that I am what I like to call a grand student of Salo Baron. Salo Baron was a professor of Jewish history at Columbia University. He had retired long before I started graduate school. He retired in 63 and I started graduate school in 72. So he was not my teacher, but I was the student of his students. And I also knew him. He walked around. He took a constitutional every day. He lived to be 95 years old. So he was a very sturdy man. And I did know him. But I was a student of his students. And that was important. That I really have a sense of that was important to me in terms of many things, of making me into a social historian. Salo Baron was certainly not a social historian like I became in the 1970s. He didn't use a computer to analyze data, but he really was concerned with ordinary people, not just with intellectuals or political leaders or other kinds of people like that. But he was also really concerned with the social, political, cultural context in which Jews lived. He didn't see the Jewish experience as sui generis. He saw the Jews as embedded in the larger society, and that was very important. And that, of course, was important to me. One of the things that is very important to me as a historian is that while I am a Jewish historian, both by training and subject matter, I also am a Habsburg historian. I study one of the peoples of this empire, the Jews. And they were a distinct people. They were not considered one of the Völker, one of the peoples of the empire. They were considered one of the religions of the empire, but they functioned as one of the peoples of the empire. And certainly Baron knew that as a child of the Habsburg monarchy, because he was born in Tarnów. Joshua Shans can correct my Polish pronunciation, which was in Western Galicia. And when he was born when was he born? I forget exactly what year he was born, but he was born in 1895 or something like that. It was part of Austria, and he went to university in Vienna. And at the university in Vienna, he did not want it. You were supposed to indicate what nationality you were part of, but you were supposed to do it by language. Well, what language was his native language? Yiddish didn't count. So Polish, German, I don't know. So I don't know what he wrote, but he crossed out the category and wrote Jüdische Nationalität, Jewish nationality. And so he was part of that group that considered the Jews a separate nation. And that infused a lot of his work, even when he wasn't telling you that it infused his work. And it certainly influenced my work. So let me conclude, because I've already gone over, I think, a little bit. How does all of this contribute to making sense of modern Jewish history? I think it does. I mean, Jews certainly modernized, assimilated, adapted to European or American culture, language, style, tastes, activities, ideologies, but they mostly associated with other Jews. And why? Because they wanted to. And maybe also because of anti-Semitism, which was a very important issue in many regions, but not in others where they did so as well. Of course, who knows what the situation is like is like today. I'm a historian. I study the past. I hide in the past, and so I don't know what the situation is like today for Jews. I don't know that Jews are assimilated with other Jews any longer, but they were certainly in Vienna or in Austria in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it's not just because of anti-Semitism, although anti-Semitism surely played some role. Okay. So that's all I want to say.
Marsha, that was wonderful. A tour de force, and you've already gotten the comment that even the past is hard to predict.
Yes, I saw that. Right. Thank you, Josh. Josh, by the way, Josh Shanes, who wrote that, is a historian of the Jews in Galicia, in Austrian Galicia. He's done other things too, but he is one of the experts in the world on Jews in Austrian Galicia. So I thank him for being here.
You have a large and enthusiastic audience of colleagues, students, friends, and the larger world. Would you like me to facilitate questions, or would you like to facilitate questions?
I'm happy to facilitate the questions. I'm very eager to have questions.
Wonderful. So participants, if you go into the React feature, you can raise your hand electronically like so. And then lower your hand. So please, why don't you feel free to raise your hand if you have a question? I will follow my colleague Eli Salzman by saying a question is a short sentence that ends in a question mark.
Right.
But Marsha, if you'd like to call on people, please feel free to stack up because if you raise your hand, it doesn't affect anybody else.
Yes, and the advantage of using the hand thing in the React button is that the computer puts it in order. So I will call on you in the order in which you raised your hand. Nobody has a question?
Yes, I do.
Oh, good, Matt.
Yeah.
Okay, you didn't raise your hand. That's why I didn't call you.
I put it on the, okay.
You don't see it, but anyway, it doesn't.
Marsha,
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, does this tell us anything about anti-Semitism that is rampant today? Or I know you're
I'm a historian,
but here's my question.
The fact is the past is a foreign country, right? I mean, it's different than the present. It shares some, obviously the present is the result of what happened in the past. So there is a connection between the past and the present. But the situation was very different, I mean, than it is today in terms of anti-Semitism. There's virtually no comparison. The past is a foreign country. Thanks, Max. Vienna, for example, was a city. I mean, Jews were emancipated in Austria in 1867. So they had equality, they had legal rights, they voted, they had civil rights, everything was fine. But there was, in fact, anti-Semitism. It was quite widespread in the late 19th century Austrian and Hungarian society. And Vienna itself was probably the city with the most well, maybe not the most, but a very important anti-Semitic movement led by a man named Karl Lueger, who led a political party called the Christian Social Party, which urged which blamed the Jews for all the ills of modern society and wanted them to be discriminated against. And that party was very successful. It won the majority of seats in the Vienna City Council in 1895, and it kept that majority until 1919. Now, of course, it had the majority when most people didn't vote yet. And I don't mean women. Of course, women didn't vote yet. I'm not even counting that half of the population. But of the half that could, that was male, the city of Vienna still had a restricted franchise. The country in 1907 had universal suffrage, universal male suffrage, but the city of Vienna, only people basically lower middle class and up could vote. So the working class couldn't vote, and they didn't pay enough in taxes, and there was no income tax yet, but they didn't pay enough in real estate tax. And only when they got the vote, they ousted the Christian socials and the Social Democrats came to power, and Vienna has been a social democratic city ever since, except for the Nazi years. So so it was a successful party. That doesn't exist in America. I mean, it's a very different environment. And I think we have to be careful to distinguish between anti-Semitisms of different sorts. And the situation is different. That's not to say that it's not nervous making here. I'm not saying that anti-Semitism isn't important in the present. I'm just saying that it's different from the past. So, it's just different from the past. That's all I could say at this point. Anybody else?
Marsha, I sent you a little note. You have Peter Veen next.
Oh, how come I don't see the hands? I don't.
Oh, that's odd.
That
Okay,
is,
well,
so maybe,
I'll
oh, there they are. Oh, okay, now I see them, but I didn't.
Excellent.
So Peter, yes, let me call on you, Peter.
Yes, thank you very much, Marsha. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I have a question about the past, but it's not about the past in Austria and Europe, but I wonder how your findings translate into to America and the experience of Jews who migrate to America, and then, like the story that of your father's story, you already indicated that, but more structurally speaking, Brooklyn, other American cities, and so on. How does it work culturally after migration?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Peter. And I will answer it both with a tiny anecdote and then what I know from the literature on the Jews in America, which I teach American Jewish history, so I know that literature quite well. The short anecdote has to do with my dissertation defense, which was in 1980, and I was at Columbia, and one of the people on my dissertation committee was Sigmund Diamond, who is a sociologist at Columbia, and he looked at me and he said, I don't know, reading about Vienna, it sounds too much like New York, and I said, well, no, I base it entirely on my Viennese evidence. But the literature on Jews in the immigrant period and in the next generation, in other words, the literature on American Jews dealing with the late 19th century, when massive numbers of Jews came from Eastern Europe, about 2 million Jews came to America between 1880 approximately and 1924. And about 80% of them came from the Russian Empire, and about 20%, well, it's probably 70% from Russia, and 20% from Austrian Galicia, and 4% from Romania, and whatever. Anyway, they tended to behave just like my Jews in Vienna. I mean, in fact, that was a very important model. Deborah Dash Moore's book on Jews in New York in the 1920s and 30s, which emphasizes how, as Jews modernized and left the immigrant neighborhood of the Lower East Side of New York, they moved to neighborhoods in Brooklyn or the Bronx, which were, if anything, more densely Jewish than the Lower East Side was, and so there's a lot of parallel between Jews in immigrant Jews in America and their children, and Jews in Central Europe. In France, there were Jewish neighborhoods too. Paula Hyman's work on the Jews of France shows that as well. And it's less true in Germany in terms of neighborhoods, but true in terms of Jewish social universes. Marion Kaplan's work on the Jews of Germany shows that as well. So there's a lot of similarity. I think that, and the American environment in the late 19th and early 20th century was far less anti-Semitic. So anti-Semitism played less of a role. But the sheer numbers of Jews, I think, played an important role there as well. I don't know if I fully answered your question, but in fairness to the other questioners, I will stop answering. But there's a lot of similarities, is the basic answer, between the Jews that I studied in Austria-Hungary and the Jewish immigrants to America and their children. Although that may be changing now, but it wasn't. It was the case, certainly through the 1950s. Okay, the next person is John Sturck.
Yeah, so my questions is a little bit parochial, but my father was from Eastern Slovakia, lived in a rural area. How did the culture of Vienna and perhaps of Prague extend out into the hinterlands?
Well, it's a good question. It's not parochial at all. It's actually a big question. Vienna was the capital of this multinational empire, and it was a German-speaking city, but it had a very mixed population, right? There were Czechs, there were Jews, there were Czechs, there were Hungarians. Hitler hated Vienna, right? When he lived in Vienna, Hitler lived in Vienna from 1907 to 1913, I think, and he had come from Upper Austria, which was, entirely a German-speaking region and a German nationalist region. And he hated Vienna because of its polyglot, polyethnic, hodgepodge nature. Now, but your question is different. Your question is, what influence did Vienna have on the far reaches of Slovakia? Well, probably not too much, because after 1867, Slovakia was part of the Kingdom of Hungary, and in all domestic matters, Budapest played a more important role than Vienna because Hungary was a quasi-independent country. And Jews who modernized would have learned Hungarian, although some of them also learned German. The more the merrier. They learned a lot of languages. In Western Slovakia, Jews would have learned German. Because of their proximity to Vienna. So in a city that is today called Bratislava, but was in the late 19th century called either by its German name, Pressburg, or its Hungarian name, Pozsony, Bratislava was invented in 1919 by the Slovaks. But that city is really close to Vienna. It's like 20 kilometers from Vienna, or maybe it's 40 kilometers, I don't know. But it's very, very close. So of course, Vienna there played a very important role. But probably in Eastern Slovakia, where your grandparents or whatever your ancestors lived, probably less of a role. Except that German was the language of enlightenment and of high culture. And it was a language, if you knew it, you could talk to other people in other countries. If you learned Hungarian, you could only talk to other Hungarians. But if you learned German, you could speak to lots of people, right? So it played some role. Okay, Jerry Dances, whom I know.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. So my father-in-law fought in the Austro-Hungarian Empire's army during World War I, and he also lost 3 uncles in one battle. So I guess he grew up in Prague, speaking German and Hungarian, and his kid brother grew up after World War I speaking Czech. This is how it goes. He was offered to become an officer after the war, and I guess the condition was that he convert.
Well, that's after the war. That's not Austria-Hungary.
Yeah, I'm just okay.
Right. It's a different country.
Right,
Please.
right. So I guess the Czech army offered to make him an officer, but I guess he was required to convert and instead.
Well, required is probably too strong. He wasn't.
Maybe.
but he would, in order to be an officer. I mean, I don't know enough about the Czechoslovak interwar period to be able to answer that, right?
Oh.
But what's your question, Jerry?
So you mentioned that let's see, when they let more people vote in Vienna, that then the Social Democrats became the majority. So one question would be, to what extent were Jews, part of that vote?
To what extent were Jews what?
To what extent were they part of the vote that changed?
Somebody has to turn off. I can't hear because somebody's got a microphone on and is talking. So people, please mute yourself unless you're talking. Okay, Jerry, I didn't hear you.
Yeah.
What?
To what extent were Jews involved in socialist politics, communist party, and to what extent were they significant in changing the city council to social democratic control?
Well, Jews were only 9% of the population, so they wouldn't have, if everybody's voting, they don't have, that much impact. But Jews were active social democrats, of course. The leader of Karl Renner wasn't Jewish, but some of the other leaders of the Social Democratic Party of Austria, people like Otto Bauer and I forget the other guys' names, but they were Jews. Jews were active in Social Democratic Party, in the Social Democratic Party, not just in Austria, also in Germany and in other countries. Russia, after all, some of the leaders of the Russian Social Democratic Party were Jews. So Jews were definitely involved in the Social Democratic Party, but Jews were also involved in various liberal parties. But the liberal parties kind of lost all clout in by the interwar period. So the sort of politics was divided in the interwar period between the left, which included the socialists and the communists, and the right, which included the Christian socials and other nationalist parties. The liberal parties had disappeared, but Jews were very active in the Social Democratic Party in many countries.
But what role did the Bund play?
The Bund, which is the Jewish Socialist Party, was not especially important in Vienna, and it wasn't even especially important in Austrian Galicia because it wasn't very industrialized. The Bund, the Jewish Socialist Party, was much more important in places where there were Jewish workers, places like Vilna in Poland, or and other cities of Poland. It had been important in the Russian Empire before that, of course, because Vilna was in the Russian Empire before it was in interwar Poland. But the Bund wasn't especially important in Vienna. The Zionists were important, of various kinds were important, and other groups were important, but the Bund existed, but it wasn't very important. Vienna wasn't an industrial city, even though it had workers. Let me call on David Siegel. You have to unmute yourself to talk. You're still muted. No, you're still muted. Why don't you try to figure out how, oh, there you go. Okay.
That work?
Yeah, that worked.
Okay. I'm curious about whether the culture of the Jewish communities in Eastern Europe had any impact on the cultures of their host society, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or was the cultural impact only one way? Was there it?
Well, I don't quite understand your question. I mean, Russian Jews did not come to Vienna or to any place in Austria-Hungary. The migration that I was talking about was all from other places in the Habsburg monarchy, from Moravia, from Galicia, which is of course Eastern Europe, and so forth. And from Western Hungary. So there aren't East European, there aren't Russian Jews coming in any. I'm sure there were 3 or 4, but they weren't there in appreciable numbers. Influence is always in both directions, though. I mean, obviously there is influence in both directions. People marry each other and so on. But the East European Jews, that is Russian Jews, don't exist in the Habsburg monarchy. They're not there. So, okay, Stefano. They came to America, is what they did, right.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for your talk. I'd written my question because at the beginning I thought that we were using the
chat.
The chat. I repeat what I've said, that it seems to me that most of the people that you have studied, more than assimilated to their society, they integrated to their society, keeping their own identity. So I have two questions. The first one is about assimilation in the proper sense. So people who really repudiated their own heritage somehow and their own identity, there must have been, I guess. Of course, anti-Semitism made that difficult and push probably to recover, to maintain your own identity because you were feeling alienated by your host society for whatever reasons. But I would like to know what was the pattern and what was the relevance of marriages with non-Jews. And the other question that is really connected to that, you gloss over the reasons.
Oh, I was only talking 30 minutes.
Yeah, no, the reasons why what define the identity of non-religious Jews. Because this is something that beyond anti-Semitism, I would say that is probably a pattern that you see in many immigrants communities. And is it only the past? If it's the past, is not really an imaging community?
Okay, you've asked some big questions that are hard to answer. So let me answer the first technical the technical question first, since it's easy to answer. You asked about non-Jewish marriage. And we actually don't know the answer to that question, because while Austria had civil marriage, it didn't have civil intermarriage. So Jews and Christians could not marry each other civilly. One of them had to convert to the religion of the other, or to a neutral category, which in German was called konfessionslos, that is, without religion. And therefore, they disappear in the statistics. You can't, there's no statistical way to find Jewish-Christian marriage, because either the Jew or the Christian became Jewish or Christian or konfessionslos, but you can't just imagine what percentage of all people who are konfessionslos were Jewish, because some of them were socialists or communists who just wanted to be without religion, right? So, and a lot of people who were with Jews who were without religion didn't convert to that category, like Sigmund Freud, right? So, so we don't know how many Jews married non-Jews in that period. And we do know how many Jews married people who are konfessionslos, but that's a small number, and it's only a small subset of the larger number. I wish I could answer the question. It's one of the questions I raise in the book: how many Jews married non-Jews? But I have no way of knowing. It did, the law though did inflate the number of Jews who converted to Christianity. There are more Jews in Vienna who converted to Christianity, about 500 a year at the turn of the century, which is a lot, actually. There were about 175,000 Jews in Vienna. And so for 500 a year to convert, that's a lot. And presumably they mostly did it to marry non-Jews, right? But again, I don't know, I can look at a few memoirs, but I don't know the answer. So that's the answer to your technical question. In terms of the Jews Jews cope with the fact that they're a complicated group that doesn't fit Christian categories, right? In modernity, in the 19th century, Jews did start in Western and Central Europe and in America to call themselves a religious community. But they weren't just a religious community. I mean, it was always a lie. Lie is too strong a word, but it was always not quite telling the truth to say that they were just a religious community, because they really functioned as an ethnic group. And you could belong to an ethnic group even if you don't practice its religion, right? There are many Jews who don't practice, like Sigmund Freud, who practiced 0 Jewish rituals, but who certainly considered themselves Jews. He certainly considered himself a Jew. There's no question. And he's not the only one. I just use him because he's a famous example. So the Jews functioned as a separate group, and anti-Semitism certainly increased that tendency to think of themselves as a separate group. But it wasn't the only factor in making them think they were a separate group. Now, how religious were Jews in general? Forget Sigmund Freud, he's an outlier, right? Most Jews were not. Many Jews were not religious by the turn of the 20th century. Or they practiced, as I write in my book, they practiced none, some, much, none, some, much, most, of Jewish religion. We don't know what percentage practiced Judaism. Some did, or some did a little bit, like Jews today in America, And how do you count certain things? If you look at sociological studies of Jews in the United States, you will discover that 80% of Jews celebrate the Passover Seder. Well, that's a religious ritual, but do they think it's a religious ritual? Probably no. They probably think of it as an ethnic marker, right? They have a Passover Seder. And what is a Passover Seder? Are they doing the traditional Passover Seder? Well, some are and some aren't. And for some, it's just getting together with the family and having a meal with certain foods, matzah and so forth. Is that religious or is it not, or is it ethnic, or is it both? Of course it's both, but it's complicated, right? So your question is hard for me to answer because of the complicated nature of Jewishness and the complicated nature of what Jewishness meant to Jews who were modernizing and yet remaining separate. And it also depends on who you look at. If you look at some intellectuals or people in the arts community, well, they probably had very little Jewish identity. But if you look at ordinary people, they may have had more, right? And so, it's hard to know. It's hard to know how to answer your question. I don't know if I have answered your question, but I've at least made an attempt.
No.
Let me see what you wrote. Post-religious Jewish.
No, thank you so much. You answered my question. If I can ask a follow-up question.
Sure, of course.
If you consider Jewishness more as an ethnic identity than a religious identity, why the Jews didn't follow the patterns of all the other, for example, in the United States, I'm pushing more of all the other ethnic, the United States is a laboratory, so it's different from Europe, in which but in the United States, they didn't follow the same patterns of all the other ethnic identities that integrated. I mean, now you have some Italians in Brooklyn, but I mean, in 50 years from now, they won't. So,
well, how many Jews will there be 50 years from now? Jews, I think they did follow the patterns of other immigrant groups of their time, the Italians and the Eastern European immigrants who came, non-Jewish Eastern European immigrants who came at the same time. But because they also had a separate religion, which the Italians did not have, right? Italians were Catholic, but so were the Irish, so were the Poles, Excuse me, although they didn't really integrate with other Catholics. There was in the 1950s this notion of the triple melting pot that America would divide into Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, and Italians and the Irish and the Poles would all be one group, but that didn't happen. They just disappeared into the American mainstream. But the Jews are disappearing into the American mainstream as well. I mean, Jewish intermarriage at the present is about 52%, something like that. That doesn't mean that 52% of all Jews are married to non-Jews. It means that if you look at all Jews marrying in a given year, 52% of them will marry non-Jews. So, but what does it mean? Some of the Jews who intermarry continue to live Jewish lives and raise their children as Jews, and others don't. So it's complicated. It's a complicated situation. But Jews were the least, well, as late as 1970, let's say. Jews were less assimilated than other white ethnic groups in America. That is true. Italians and other white ethnic groups had assimilated more than Jews. But Jews that just may be a time lag. you know, and it may be, you know, further advanced now than in 1970. I don't know. I mean, sociologists do study this, and they divide into, you know, all sorts of camps, you know, in terms of evaluating it. So, anybody else have a question?
I have a question.
Sure.
I have a question that is a scholarly question, but it's about your scholarship as a whole person.
Uh-huh.
Both of the examples that you chose to give in your multi-point backdrop to your work were relational examples. They were examples that caused you to think in a critical scholarly fashion, but that were connected with relationships to people who were older than you and whom you respected and with whom you had personal connections. How much do you think the project of a historian comes out of these like identity pieces or the quirky moments or the places where your full self is engaged? And how much of a historian's project is one that's more just so driven by the intellectual question? I mean, I already know the answer is both and, but do you think that historians are attracted to their scholarship in some ways because of, you know, talk to me a little bit about that. And
Well,
it looks like Michael Bailey has a question as well.
Oh, good. I'll call on them as well. But you know, it's too complicated to disentangle.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, for me, as a Jew from New York, I was in fact interested in the nature of this issue of assimilation and identity and the relationship between Jews wanting to be part of the larger world and also remaining Jewish in some way, however that way was defined. But for other historians, that's less of an issue. Why did my husband, who was an ancient historian, become an ancient historian? I mean, he wasn't ancient, you know, and he wasn't Greek or Roman, you know, an ancient Greek or Roman. And he loved the ancient world, and he found it incredibly challenging and interesting. But he was interested in the nature of ancient urbanism and what that teaches us. He was interested in many things, but he really loved trying to understand this very foreign culture. And so not everybody studies their own, right? You don't have to be a thing to study a thing. Right? I mean, I didn't go into Jewish history as part of some kind of identity politics. There are people who do.
Oh, and I wouldn't dream of accusing you of that.
No, I
I was
know you
more
wouldn't.
intrigued by how the
Yeah.
questions are formed.
Yeah, no, I know that. I know you weren't accusing me of anything, but it's true that my personal, you know, life experience played an important role in it. I mean, I didn't want to study the Holocaust because, frankly, it's too depressing. But the Holocaust surely played a role. My father was a survivor of Auschwitz. I mean, how could it not have played a role in my life, right? And my father came from a generation of Jews in Poland, born into a completely religious family, who in the 1930s became a modern person, you know, and was no longer as religious as when he grew up, and was no longer as, you know, he read Polish novels for pleasure. I mean, he was part of Polish society, but he was profoundly Jewish, and you know, his experience, but he was in Auschwitz, for God's sakes. Now, obviously the Poles didn't put him in Auschwitz, the Nazis did, but he, that had to play a role in my, you know, but I didn't have a grudge, you know, I didn't have an axe to grind. I was genuinely intellectually interested in what it meant for Jews to be part of the larger world and still Jewish.
Yeah.
And what did it mean? That the question is what intrigued me, not
right. That was precisely what I was getting at. I knew I was going to study chaos, but I wasn't sure that if I was going to study chaos in Second Temple Judaism of the first century or the chaos of late mid 20th century social movements, and I had to pick one. But yeah, so in some ways, what you've been describing is this wonderful set of questions that are about finding real people and finding out what real people did, and using the evidence available to you, not to talk necessarily about specific individuals, but to talk about the possibilities for everyday life, which is, of course, part of the agenda of a social
Right.
historian.
And I did sometimes give examples of specific human beings, obviously, because otherwise it gets boring. You know, it is interesting to deal with actual people. But I am interested in how ordinary people understood their environment. I'll just give you one tiny example. When I was doing my World War I book, I found the war diary of a Jewish soldier from Vienna. Not terribly well educated. I mean, he was certainly literate, but, you know, not well educated. He probably only went to the 8th grade because that's all that was required. But his diary was fabulously interesting. And what it was mostly interesting about was not his experiences in the army, although those were very interesting, and I used them in the book. But what was really interesting was how he understood what he understood about himself as a man, as a human, as a male person, you know, as a man. And he went out with girls, and how he understood his relationship with these girls. He called them girls. I should say women, but he called them girls. It's just incredible. Ken and I read this. Ken read it. Ken's German was excellent, and he read my husband. He read this diary. He wanted me to publish it. He thought it was so fabulous, you know. And it's because of the stuff about being a man and going out with women and what was a man like in the early 20th century, you know. So there's lots of things, you know, and my article about Jewish marriage practices in Vienna in the 1920s includes him. I did write about his manhood, you know, and how he chose a wife for himself who wasn't especially pretty, but she was a good girl, you know, and so forth. Okay, Michael had a question. Michael Bailey.
So Michael's microphone isn't working, but Michael asks about taking advantage of this unique forum of the 5 Points lecture to ask a bit more meta, unorthodox question. You mentioned your scholarly heritage as a grand student of Baron, and we today look to Baron's biography in order to understand some of his motivations and scholarly perspectives. So kind of following up on my question, Michael takes it to the next step. What are some things you imagine future scholars may see in your own biography that provide important context to your work? And I would probably add and expand outward from there, given what you just said, the way that your scholarship has a contribution in the field of feminist understanding as well as historical understanding.
Big question too. And Michael Bailey, just, you know, to tell everybody, is my student, my PhD student. So my own biography, well, the stuff coming from New York, you know, being the child of Holocaust survivors. I mean, those are certainly, well, one, my mother was American. But that played a role to some important extent. Actually, I'll give an example of that. When I was in Vienna in 1976 doing my dissertation research, I experienced anti-Semitism directed at me personally. That is, anti-Semitic remarks made to me. Vienna then was, it's not true anymore, but it was true then, that, you know, it was unselfconsciously, people were unselfconscious. They thought it was okay to say anti-Semitic things to Jews. I mean, it was nothing terrible, nothing horrible. It was things like, you know, taxi drivers saying to me in German, you know, are you Israeli? No, why do you ask? Oh, you speak German as if you learned it from Jews, which is not true. I have an American accent in German, but he just wanted to tell me, I know who you are. You know, so, but anyway, I was not used to that. It shocked me because I came from New York. And not that there weren't anti-Semites in New York, I'm sure there were, but you know, the city was very Jewish, and you hid in the Jewish community. You know, you lived in this Jewish social universe. You hardly encountered non-Jews. So I went to public school. You know, everybody was Jewish. The teachers were Jewish. The kids were Jewish. You know, well, it's not really true. There were lots of kids who weren't, but not lots. There were some. So that certainly had an impact. I mean, I try to understand, you know, how does one. It actually helped me to experience this anti-Semitism, understand why many Central European Jews chose not to pay attention to anti-Semitism, because it helped them cope to not pay attention, right? You can't constantly pay attention to everybody who hates you, because then you can't live your life normally. You know, you have to live your life normally. You have to, you know, get up in the morning and eat breakfast and, you know, whatever. And I understood that. I mean, because did I respond to all these people who said slightly nasty things to me? No, of course not. I just let it roll off my back. I didn't like it, but I let it roll off my back, and it helped me understand them. So that would be some aspects. Now, the feminist question is also very important. I was certainly a feminist, but I am a feminist, but I didn't do women's history, right, at the beginning of women's history. I was always sensitive to women. I always included women in my work. No question, it was important to me to always include women. And so I have, you know, stuff about women in my book, and I have both of my books, but mostly my book isn't addressing the issue of women, because I was frankly at the time much more interested in Jews in general. And I thought women were an important part of Jews in general, but I didn't want to focus just on women. I knew people who did, you know, but I didn't. So I may have disappointed. It's a slightly disappointing answer, but I have not really focused on women, although my article on Jewish courtship and marriage does deal with women more than some of my other work. I mean, I deal with this guy, his name was Theophil Reis, but I also deal with Ernestina Drucker-Freud, who was Freud's daughter-in-law and married to his son Martin, and with another woman named Priva Friedjung, who was a communist, and I think there was a fourth person that I dealt with, and I forgot who it was. But anyway, so I did focus on women in that article, but I dealt with men as well. By the way, there is a question from Maddie Siegel, who's a sociologist, I have now learned, and she writes, I am very interested in the relationship between Jews and African Americans. Well, that is a very interesting relationship. It doesn't affect my work because there were no African Americans in late 19th century Austria, but Jews did have to cope with diversity of a different sort. I mean, American diversity is racial and also immigrant groups, you know, ethnic diversity. But in the Habsburg monarchy, the Habsburg monarchy had officially 11 languages and officially 11 peoples. In fact, there were more than 11, but officially there were 11. There were Germans and Czechs and Poles and Ukrainians and Italians and Romanians and Slovaks and Slovenes and Croats and I don't know, I haven't gotten up to 11, but there were 11. And the Jews too, right? Although the Jews weren't counted as one of the peoples. And these different groups had to cope with each other in different places. In Galicia, and I don't know if he's still here. I think he may have disappeared. Joshua Shanes has written about Jews in Galicia and how, you know, they had to cope with the complications of their relationship to the Poles and the Ukrainians, both of which were anti-Semitic in different ways, right? The Poles were angry. Well, the Ukrainians were angry because they saw the Jews as siding with the Poles. The Poles were angry because when the Jews said that they were Zionists and neutral in the conflict, that was pro-Ukrainian, the Poles thought. So the Poles hated the Jews. And so the Jews were in like this third group in the middle, and it was very complicated. And figuring out the best political strategy was very complicated for the Jews. It was very complicated. So anyway. But African Americans is an American question, and the relationship between Jews and African Americans is complicated. Obviously, Jews were very active in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, and then Jews felt alienated as from African Americans as they became more militant in the late 1960s and 70s, and so it's a complicated relationship, as you probably know way better than I do. Somebody else asked me, could Theodor Herzl become someone else if he grew up in a different environment, e.g. Russia? Well, everybody would be different in a different environment, 100%. And Herzl is an interesting figure. Herzl was Budapest born from a prosperous upper middle class family. He had a bar mitzvah, well, so did Freud for that matter, but he, was certainly not religious at all. But he, of course, created the modern Zionist movement. He says in reaction to anti-Semitism, he and his family moved to Vienna in 1918, not 1918, when he was 18 in 1878. And he was long dead by 1918. But he was very much a product of the Hungarian environment in which he grew up, of the Viennese environment in which he spent his adult life. It's interesting, though, that he didn't invent a Zionism, which most of the Jews in the Habsburg monarchy invented. And Joshua Shaines has written about this, and others too. That is, when the Jews of Galicia became Zionists, they mostly acted like Polish or Ukrainian nationalists. They adopted the same tactics as the Polish nationalists or the Ukrainian nationalists. Herzl was different. Herzl didn't so much. He was responding to anti-Semitism, and he wasn't like them. I mean, the nationalist movements of Austria were very concerned, for example, with the issue of language and creating a language. Herzl was not. Herzl wrote in the Jewish State, what language shall we speak in this new country? Not Hebrew, certainly. None of us knows enough Hebrew to buy a railroad ticket in that language. He didn't even know that Jews in Palestine were creating modern Hebrew and had already invented the word for railroad and ticket and whatever. But he was wrong on that issue because he wasn't influenced by his environment as much as he might have been. If he was born in Russia, he would have been totally different again, so of course. Now, Jerry Dancis also wrote, New Yorkers grew thicker skins, at least in the 1950s, when I grew up there. Thicker skins about anti-Semitism, you mean, Jerry? I grew up in the 1950s too. You're not that much older than me.
Well, not just anti-Semitism, but minor insults.
Yeah, well, everybody people that, minor insults exist in many societies and towards many groups. Obviously, the Italian Americans suffered from more than minor insults in America. Italians were considered not white, well, so were Jews, also were not considered white until they became white. But so.
Well, and you also had maybe Northern Italians not living on the same streets as Southern Italians.
But most of the immigrants to the United States were Southern Italians. I would say 95% of all Italians in America were either Sicilian or Neapolitan or Calabrian or, whatever, not Northern Italians. So there's a lot more we can talk about. I must tell you that I have always loved studying the Jews in the region I study. Not because they're so wonderful, they're people, so some are wonderful and some are terrible, right? But it's so interesting, the very complexity of this world is so interesting. And I love it. Just the fact that it was a multilingual world and is quite extraordinary. And when I was a graduate student, the communist Eastern Europe didn't allow scholars in to do much work. And so I didn't learn one of the Eastern European languages. I learned German, of course, and I knew Hebrew and I knew Yiddish. And so I you know, I did know a bunch of languages, and French, but French is irrelevant. So I didn't learn Czech or Polish or Hungarian, and I regret that because I think it would be fabulous, interesting to study the Jews who did speak those languages. I wish I knew those languages, but the older you get, the harder it is to learn new languages. So it's too late now. But anyway. So more questions.
I want to take just a second, Marsha, to thank everyone who's joined us. This has been such a delight. If people are able to stay for a few more minutes, that's wonderful.
Sure.
I don't want people to feel rude about needing to leave. It is such a pleasure to hear you talk about your scholarship and to show how it fits together in even more ways than we might have already realized. Thank you so much, Marsha.
You're welcome. But I realized, Max, that you wrote a question that I didn't see. What was the Viennese Jewish impact on Vienna? That's a very good question.
That was actually reiterating something that someone else had asked.
Oh, I see. But, you know, the fact is, influence goes both directions. Obviously, it's not like the Jews are this passive group that adopts certain aspects, assimilates, you know, and adopts certain aspects, and doesn't influence. The influence doesn't go in the other direction. Of course, influence went in the other direction as well. And it's hard to measure all of that influence, but Jews were a major part of the Viennese scene. They were, the theater had a lot of Jews in it. The press had a lot of Jews in it. Theodor Herzl, after all, was the most famous journalist in Vienna. He wasn't just some person who invented Zionism. He was the feuilleton editor of the Neue Freie Presse. Well, the Neue Freie Presse was the leading German language newspaper of Europe in the late 19th century. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was a major newspaper. He was the equivalent of the features editor of it. He was a very famous person. So yes, of course. And Jews were active in Social Democratic Party politics and liberal politics and in the Communist Party as well. That's later, but Jews are an important part of the scene in Vienna, and there are Yiddish words in Viennese German. They're still to this day. I mean, there are in Viennese dialect there are Yiddish words. It's probably fading now because there's not the continued presence of Yiddish speakers, but certainly in the 1970s, words like mishpucha and metzia and I don't know, other words were in Viennese German, and those are Hebrew words in Yiddish, but it doesn't matter. They came to Viennese German not directly from Hebrew, but from Yiddish. So yes, of course, the influence went both ways. It's hard to measure these things, though. It's easier to measure it in the case of the influence on the Jews, because the Jews had originally come from an environment which was more closed off from European culture, and they embraced European culture in the course of the 19th century. So it's obvious that they were adopting European ways in clothing and household furniture, in recreational style, in education. I mean, Jews, you know, stopped knowing Talmud and Torah. They learned Homer and Herodotus, you know, right? So obviously they adopted Western culture, but the influence goes in both directions.
I think we're going to shut off the recording now, but I want to thank you so much, Marsha, and everyone, please join me in thanking Marsha for a really delightful occasion and a wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much.